here on Zoom. We're also live on YouTube if you want to watch it that way. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the PRI, we are the world's largest responsible investment initiative. We've got 4,000 signatories who collectively represent 121 trillion US in assets under management, and we're really delighted to partner with our good friends at Climate Bonds on this event. So as a global organisation, we see trends in financial markets across the world, and increasingly this includes economic, transition, and physical risks, and all of these different trends, such as the impact of extreme weather events and shifts in our climate affecting communities and economies, like the recent heat wave in the Western United States, the floods in Europe and China, which have all, of course, been linked to human-induced climate change. So in step with the growing threat of climate change is increasing demand from the financial community for information, for analysis, for forecasting, to help them understand and incorporate climate and broader ESG factors into their investment practices. And I really think that the PRI's growing signatory base, it just surpassed 4,000 in the last month, really exemplifies that growing demand. It's clear that demand for decision-useful information is growing at an unprecedented rate. This includes understanding the changing policy landscape, both what's happening now, but also what's likely to happen in the future. The climate crisis is global. There's changes around the world in policy and in other areas, and it of course affects every economy and has implications for every company, public and private, around the world. It also increasingly is considered in every decision every decision that an investor is making. And there's really no way to disentangle the climate crisis from our financial markets. But there are ways to acknowledge this fact, to take action, to incorporate it into our investment decisions and into our overall investment objectives. And this is one of the reasons that the PRI originally commissioned the Inevitable Policy Response, or IPR program, which we're going to discuss today. It's really designed to help investors, to help our signatories to understand and navigate the changing landscape. And I think with the G20 around the corner in October and just under 100 days until COP26, action on climate change from business, investors, finance, policymakers is inevitable. We're going to see more action, both in that short and longer term. If we think further afield, in 2023, we have the global stocktake, followed by the 2025 Paris Ratchet mechanism, and all of these will bring about further inevitable change. So today we'll look at where the policy landscape is heading, what levers governments are most likely to pull, from coal phase-out dates, phasing out of the internal combustion engine, to changes in land use and agricultural practices, and everything in between. And we'll discuss the impact for investors and how you can stay ahead of an acceleration of government policy and other action across the world. So I'm really fortunate to be joined by three fantastic panelists. So I've got Ashley Schutten, who's the Managing Director and Head of Responsible Investment for Global Fixed Income at BlackRock, and she's based in the US, in New York, and is up bright and early. You can see the blackness behind her, and that's because it's, you know, very early in the morning. I've got Mark Fulton, who's the Program Director of the Inevitable Policy Response, or IPR, and Mark's based in Sydney, Australia. And I have got Sean Kidney, who's the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative, who's based here in London along with me. So we've got some global perspectives to be able to bring. We're going to start with Mark in a presentation and where Mark's going to outline what the IPR that I'm talking about actually is, talk a little bit about our body of work and the top 10 predictions to 2030. And then we'll bring in Ashley and Sean into the discussion to talk about the investor view, to talk about the policy landscape and what's happening in the US, in Europe and China, amongst other things. We also want to make sure that we hear from you and your thoughts and questions. So make sure you send them in through the Q&A button on the screen, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can in the hour or so that we've got for this discussion. So now let me hand over to Mark Fulton, who, as I said, is the Program Director at the Inevitable Policy Response. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks, everyone, and welcome from lockdown Sydney. So what I'm going to do is to share my screen with you so I can run through a short presentation on exactly what Fiona has well described already, I have to say. So if I get this right. So essentially, we're looking here, as we've said, at the Climate Policy Acceleration Outlook and the impact on investors. And essentially, we're preparing financial markets for climate-related policy and regulatory risks. Sorry about that, hang on. So in terms of who are we, in a sense, we see ourselves as a consortium. We were actually commissioned by the PRI. I took the idea to them in 2018. And Vivid Economics is the major modeling group. My own group, Energy Transition Advisors, is involved. And we have a number of partners from the civil society, 2 Degree Investing, Carbon Tracker, Climate Bonds, Planet Tracker. And we have support from the Finance Hub and the Morecambe Foundation, Climate Works Foundation. So that is a quick snapshot of who we are. And I will say that we also have a new program of strategic partners, of which Ashley is a member. So what was the whole idea? The idea of this was really quite simple back in 2018. It's that essentially it seemed to me and my cohort that we're going to see another big push on policy. Time was getting ready, time was running out, and pressure was growing. And what were those pressures? Nothing that would surprise you in a sense. Back then, I think civil society action was really gathering pace back in 2018 again. But the extreme weather events were beginning. And one of our first presentations, I was able to put up a Murdoch Press headline, "World on Fire," which I enjoyed. So essentially, that now we're seeing the extreme weather events with the flooding in Germany now reaching a new crescendo, fires again in America. And I think there's just this realization, and the climate scientists are starting to say, whoa, this looks a lot worse than we thought. Security impacts, migration. We're going to see financial regulators. But I leave, one of the key drivers is cheaper alternatives, renewable energy, whatever it is, EVs, everything's getting cheaper. And this enables the policymakers to take action. So these are the key drivers which make it what we called inevitable. So essentially what we were trying to do is to look at how this inevitable policy response would play out in relation to technology trends, how it could affect the economy, and therefore how it might affect investors. So I would say that, we say that we're a high conviction policy-based forecast. Now, as we're looking at realistic policy and technology expectations, it's not a hypothetical optimal pathway that says, well, I'd like to get to a certain place, can I? This says, where do you think you're going to go? So we're transparent on our expectations. We have complete forecast, including land use. I think that's very important for us. We have a big emphasis on land use, which is rare in these models, which tend to be energy focused. And we do cover all regions in the world. And again, I think we are very applicable to TCFD reporting, which we've seen, and BlackRock did actually report on using IPR. What we are doing that's new this year, and I'll come back to it at the end, is that we are doing, actually having said we're going to forecast, we felt we would do a 1.5C required policy scenario. So what we'll do is we'll say, okay, if you really want to get to a very stringent 1.5 outcome, such as the IEA did with NZE, what do we think you need to do, particularly on policy? So in a way, it's a required policy. If you really want to get to 1.5, you have to do an awful lot beyond our forecasts. So essentially,
Hey, Mark, I've just got some people in the chat, in the question and answer person. Can you put the screen? They're asking, can you put you on full screen?
Sorry if I
Yeah.
failed to do
Sorry,
that.
sorry to interrupt.
I think we've got to get this right. Does that do it? Oh yeah! Wow. Whew. Technology. So sorry everyone. So you can see here that we do indeed have very large coverage at a regional level, and I think that's very important. We're covering, you know, up to 80% of economic activity, energy use and emissions, and it's widespread. If one thing I do feel that we all lack in modeling is a better view of what's going on in Africa for the longer term, but that's something that everyone struggles with. So, you know, it's going to report our results, you know, do cover at a very strong at a regional level, which is crucial for us. So essentially, what did we do on our policy forecast? So we launched in 2019, but this year, earlier this year, we ran a process to look at how our policies were going and what people thought about them. And the key to that was an expert survey of 200 plus leading experts, national climate policy, some policymakers themselves. We sent it out, what we'd done in 2019. We asked a number of questions about what they thought about it, timing, content, and so on. I must say we were very happy that people came back and said, well, we definitely think you're on the right track. Obviously, a lot of people thought we might be a bit early in our forecasts because we're saying all of this will have occurred by 2025, our forecasts. And some of our content was probably a little aggressive for some. But nevertheless, this allowed us to move ahead and look at what we're doing again for this year. So what drives our forecasts in a sense now on a more detailed level? We've seen the big drivers, but we're looking at what current policy ambition is. What is the track record of that, of what the trends are in policy? What is the status of the transition itself? Then we, as I say, we back it up with how is civil society pushing on that? How is the investment pipeline looking in terms of these, in terms of what the policies might target? And I think very importantly, consumer preferences. It's very important to decide whether society itself is really going to change. So you have these behavioral elements. They are some of the hardest to call, but they're absolutely crucial, particularly when it comes to land use. So again, techno-economics, what are the latest technology trends? We're very up to date with those. How is industrial competitiveness affected? Trade exposure. We take into account industrial strategy. Importantly for us, energy security needs to be taken into account, but the just transition is crucial. You cannot pull off these types of policy initiatives that we're talking about, which are quite deep, unless you carry society with you. And some of that is going to mean working with the losers. They need to be helped. They need to, transition needs to be put in place. And we did quite a lot of work with that with the Grantham Institute. So what are we saying in 2021? Essentially, we come across these major levers, as we call them. These are the obvious, I'd say obvious key policy levers that all policymakers are going to be looking at. They've got to look at carbon pricing. And I will say, and I'll come to it a bit later, I do believe in 2018, when we floated carbon border adjustment mechanisms, we were thought to be mad at the time, but I think things are coming our way. And we do believe with the launch of the Chinese carbon market and so on, we are going to see an inevitable ratchet up in those prices and a spreading of carbon pricing. Coal phase out is dear to everyone's heart, including the UK at the coming COP. It's not easy. The heavy coal regions are obviously pushing back. And so, however, we believe, again, the pressure from civil society, from the whole system will come about with electricity market reforms and performance standards. You're going to see a continued push to get coal out of the system. That sort of aligns with the 100% clean power world. It's nice to say 100%. I'm not sure, you know, everyone will get to 100%, but I think they're going to make a good push to it. And as you'll see, The US is a key target for us there, with the EU well on the way, and China, that's the big question in relation to their coal fleet. So zero emission cars, again, you know, when we published in 2019, we had what we thought were very aggressive estimates of coal, of phase out of the internal combustion engine. It seems that governments want to beat our forecasts. So that's sort of, you know, key area. Low carbon buildings, it's something more we've looked at. People forget that the building stock is absolutely crucial to this. It's a huge source of emissions. So again, we see more action there. Now in industry, you're going to see that we make a big call on what might happen in the industrial sector on performance standards. And again, let's move to the agricultural sector. These are, I think, to some extent, particularly on deforestation, some of the toughest calls to make, but we are making them. We believe the pressure to end deforestation will be so great that the key countries will come into play here. And that will also be aligned with low emissions agriculture. Again, I think there's a lot of great work being done on that. And I think we can look forward to a time where we'll see more and more in the agricultural sector. And then also in forestry, it's not just deforestation, there's a lot of reforestation that's needed as well. Again, note a just transition lens is there to make sure that we are covering those aspects. So I think it's worth actually, we thought it would be very useful to look at how that played out in relation to our previous set of forecasts. What did the experts tell us? And again, where did that leave us? And what we found is the experts really did back a tightening up. And we felt we could move to higher ambition. We could move to higher ambition because the world was already moving. Biden's election was obviously very important. China's the whole shift to the net zero country announcements, this is all really gathered pace in the last 12 months or more. And so that really made us feel that we could really push much harder on our forecasts, that they were being validated and we could go deeper. And we, as I said, we put more emphasis on clean power, low carbon buildings, and industry and agriculture again in our forecast this time. Whoops. So what are our top 10 policy forecasts? So they are carbon border adjustment mechanisms is one of our top ones. And we actually think the United States is now thinking about it. And we think the United States could look at a national carbon pricing system, maybe after the midterms, certainly by 2025. And we think that, I always believe there's no way the US Senate would pass a carbon pricing system without a CBAM. That was stated a long time ago. So now they're talking CBAM, let's see where it heads. But I think these are very important. And while they're going to take literally a few years to put in place with WTO challenges, we understand all that, we think there's a strong push here. I mean, again, the EU leading the way with the carbon market. Coming to coal, I think we believe that India, and I think Sean will talk more about this, but I think India is definitely, thinking very hard about new coal. The key though is China. Will China be able to get a 1.3, gigawatt, 1,300 gigawatt power system, decarbonized power fleet? That's a hell of a challenge. It's got to start with the banning of new coal-fired production, which we think comes from 2025 onwards, and then a massive program to retire in some format going into the 2060 net zero target. And the United States, we think, is set for economic reasons just to retire its coal by 2030. So clean power, I suppose, yeah, we are saying 100% by 2040. President Biden wants to go a bit earlier than that, but we think it can be done. It can get there. Whether it's congressional or regulatory through the EPA, we'll wait to see, but hopefully it'll be congressional. Again, zero emissions vehicles, very strong, China, France, Germany, Korea. And we continue to think the auto industry itself is helping to drive that, quite honestly. I think a big call for us is on industry. We believe that the US, Germany, Japan, and China will require industrial plants led by steel and cement to be low carbon by 2040. And of course, the CBAM is the first shot across that bow of that sector. And so I think that we see a lot more action coming in industry. Again, agriculture, we think there will be comprehensive mitigation policy put in place to reduce emissions from crops and livestock. I think there's some really interesting technology also coming in agriculture, very, very interesting, which we'll be exploring. And land use, as I say, our big call is that major tropical forest deforestation will end by 2030. We are giving ourselves 9 years, and domestic policy will continue to respond. So those are the big forecasts. We are looking as a result for investors to take action. Simply put, I wouldn't wait for it all to happen. If you think we're right, act now. Better to get on with it. Don't wait around, because markets price very early. And in fact, looking back on it in 2019, when we made a call that some of these policies would be enacted by 2025, had you looked at as you know, the 2020 relative pricing effects in markets and equities, then it would have been good to have acted early. So what I will leave you with is a thought that what are we going to do for the rest of the year? In October, we will publish an update based on these policy forecasts, plus our reassessment of technology trends. We will publish a new, what we call forecast policy scenario, the FPS. And we'll release that along with a set of what we call deep value drivers that will allow investors to take those and implement them into their portfolios or with their consultants. What we are doing, as I said, that's different is by the COP26, we are going to develop this required policy scenario, the 1.5C, and it will include a big look at land in that again. And that, I think, is the right way to look at it myself. It is a required policy scenario because you need a lot of policy to get to 1.5. So I shall leave you with that.
Thanks, perfect, Mark. There's quite a few people in the Q&A who've asked about getting a copy of the presentation. So we will make sure that everybody does get a copy of the presentation afterwards. So I want to bring in now Ashley and Sean. I'll start with Ashley. So Ashley, Mark talked about, a number of policy predictions that are there, whether it was from coal in China, coal in India, about the US retiring its coal fleet, and zero emissions vehicles, etc. So looking at the IPR views of really that acceleration by policymakers, is that sort of a common view amongst investors in your opinion? How do you sort of regard these scenarios? And I know that Mark was talking about the fact that you've become one of the strategic partners at BlackRock. So how are you going to use this kind of information in your investment decision making?
Yeah, and thanks, Fiona. Maybe I can talk a little bit about what drove our decision here at BlackRock to get more engaged with the IPR and with some of the scenario work. I think as everybody recognizes, the space is moving very quickly in terms of net zero commitments, Paris ratchets, science-based targets being set by companies, clients of ours asking for more Paris-aligned portfolios, or how can we align our portfolio to net zero? And at the same time, we're also asking companies to give us scenario analysis in terms of what their business model looks like in the transition scenario. And I think that there's been a lot of interesting commitment on this, a lot of forward-looking goals. And I think we felt that there probably was not enough work that's being done on the actual underlying scenario that we're driving these net zero or science-based targets or Paris-aligned portfolios, et cetera, on. And so we were keenly interested in unpacking the onion, if you will, with partners that we have done work with through the years. So whether it's Climate Bonds, 2 Degrees, Carbon Tracker, PRI, et cetera. And so it really gave us an opportunity to really unpack this scenario, to feed into it, We think we might have some insight into what the latest technological advances are, some comments on the policy. We were, I think, particularly interested in the addition of land use. I think that we were particularly interested in the treatment of negative emission technologies. Up to just recently, we've all been using these models that, for the last few years have relied on IEA 450. Now I know that's evolved and they have new scenarios, but I don't know if we were all in consensus that that was probably the most likely. And granted, it's not a prediction, it's a scenario. But we were really interested in partnering with these groups to try to coalesce around what might be more realistic scenarios. And so that's what's been really driving our involvement in it. I would say that I think a lot of the projections that you see always look ambitious, but as Mark pointed out, in hindsight, they looked ambitious too, and a lot of them were realized, which is great news. What's interesting about putting those thoughts on paper and putting them into a scenario is that it really opens the Overton window in your mind of what's possible, right? And so I would say, Sean and I have been working on green bonds for I don't know how many years now. The years are going by, but I think 5 years ago, Sean, we would have said, would we ever have imagined at this date we would be where we are? And I think that we made some ambitious goals, and we've probably even surpassed them. And so it helps with the imagination of what's possible, and then it also helps us to have a better view in terms of the sector build outs and the details that go in to what we're asking for in terms of net zero alignment.
Fantastic, thanks, Ashley. Sean, I want to come. I want to come back to what's happening in policy around the world, China, etc. shortly. But first of all, following up on what Ashley was saying, so Climate Bonds has a view that this decade up to 2030 is a green window for investors to act, and you've consistently called for trillions in green and sustainable investment. So what do you see as the biggest opportunities from all of the things that Mark was just talking about that have really been identified by IPR for investors?
Well, obviously, we want the entire assets under management of BlackRock to go green. This is our objective in life. And that's about making sure there are really powerful opportunities so BlackRock's portfolio managers can say, hey, this is going to work. This is what IPR gives us a clue about. So for me, what IPR is about is not just what the future will look like, because let's face it, we now have consensus amongst most parties around the world that the future will be clean and green. The debate is it going to be in 2030 or 2060? So it's the speed of change, which is also the critical factor to meet our climate goals. If we don't change rapidly enough, we lose our window, which is this decade's window in the IPCC's world, to affect change and to stop catastrophic climate change. And we go into a kind of dark feedback loops where we end up somewhere in the 6 to 8 degree Celsius warming temperature, which is unmanageable. So the IPR says covers speed. It covers not only the speed we need, which is underpinning the thinking, but the speed that is actually likely. And what really tells you it's a predictor. It's a predictor. We've seen some extraordinary changes already. Think about the capitalization of Ørsted versus BP over the last 10 years, where last year Ørsted overtook BP in capitalization, despite being a small company in Denmark 15 years ago, or NextEra and Exxon. We saw a similar sort of thing happening. That is about where the world is going, and IPR gives you a clue about where we can expect to see changes going forward. So it's a prediction tool, in my point of view, and at least that's what I like about it. And I think we're going to see a lot more Tesla Forward style changes coming forward, where Tesla was a minnow, as you know, 15 years ago, and now it's way, way, way larger than Ford. Now, whether Tesla is overvalued or not, that's a separate issue. I'll leave that to Ashley and her team to decide. But the point is, there's a significant reorientation going underway, recalibration in the economy, driven by the changes at a policy level, including in China, which we'll come back to in a minute. But the Biden Climate Summit was a real marker of what is going to happen in the future. And this fleshes out for us. It tells you where to look. It tells you what is likely. It tells you what is inevitable. And that's why it's so critical.
So do you think then, Sean, that asset managers, asset owners should be making bigger calls sooner on their portfolios on energy, sustainable infrastructure, the transition more generally?
Look, if we even get anywhere near the 2030 global commitments that all the major economies have now made, it is a revolution in our economies and our societies. We are talking about 50% cuts in emissions, just as one of the factors that's taken into account in here. So if you're an investor or asset manager, one thing you can be 100% certain of, there is a tsunami coming. Now, the question is, will we ride the tsunami or get swamped by the tsunami?
Yeah.
And what this report is about understanding what the tsunami looks like.
Yeah, okay. So let's talk about, move and talk about some of the things that are happening in policy. I want to start with the EU. So, you know, the EU's got its new climate plan, and CBAMs have been discussed. So, Mark, IPR has some pretty strong forecasts on many of the areas that are already outlined in the EU plan: EV take-up, industry transition, and particularly carbon pricing. What initial impact do you see that the EU plan has had on policymakers?
Look, I think EU is patently a climate policy leader. I mean, it is. So I think the EU continuing to push in all the time to, can we deepen it? Can we do more? Can we do more? That's such an important leadership role that they play, and therefore all their plans play some role in doing that. Again, you know, for me, the leadership in the carbon border adjustment mechanisms is an example. But then if you've got a 75, euro carbon price, you probably need a CBAM. So I think, particularly if you've got to phase out free credits, which is key, they have to phase out the free credits. What is heavy industry going to do for competitive reasons? I mean, that's why, I'm actually by training, from the dismal science, and I'm an economist, right? And sometimes though, the economics is inevitable too. So, you get these forces are at play. So I think the EU is very, very important.
So Ashley, what has been the general investor reaction? Do you think this gives investors more confidence about the big calls that the IPR scenarios predict? And does the policy changes in the EU help move things along from your perspective at BlackRock?
Definitely. I think that, policy support is so important. I think that after Paris, the narrative was governments cannot do this themselves. We need to pool in private capital. How do we do that? And I would say now, I think that the narrative needs to be back on, we definitely need to continue to see policy support. So investors react to clear messaging on policy. And I think that gives investors confidence that there is going to be a commitment on a go-forward basis to some of the policies that I think have been flirted with in the last number of years. And so, so it definitely continues to hammer in the momentum that net zero is happening, that governments are serious about it, and we are going to see policy changes that will drive this.
So it's a bit push and pull, isn't it? So investors can't sit around waiting always for governments to act, but at the same time, it certainly helps get action when everyone's moving in the same direction, which is what we need. But Sean, you've really been, intricately involved from day one in developing the EU standards around sustainable finance, but you've also been a prominent voice calling for greater international cooperation between China, between the EU, the United States on climate and investment, which is important because at the end of the day, capital's global. So what's your assessment about what's happening around the world?
Look, there are two big risks for investors that are here. One is there's a climate impact risk issue, floods and typhoons and collapse of PG&E. There is a risk there, but the risk that we're primarily talking about at today and in the IPR, from my perspective, is around the risk of action, but let's call it the likelihood of action for our purposes today. So we have policy risk already happening. I mean, bear in mind the reason we have cheap solar for municipalities in the US that are now not building gas and building solar plants instead is because of strong policy action taken by Germany in 2001 and then China in 2007. Large-scale feed-in tariffs and large-scale contracting drove down the unit price of solar, and now we're all reaping the benefit all around the world of cheap solar without subsidy everywhere. That's an example of the policy action we've already seen which is driving change. The reason why EVs are working isn't Elon Musk's magic, although that has been incredibly useful and important. It's actually been China's activist subsidy of electric vehicles, a shift for a variety of reasons, current account deficit, don't want to bring oil through the Straits of Malacca where the US Navy can blockade them, all of these reasons, driving the electric vehicle industry and forcing all manufacturers to invest in EVs, which is driving down the cost. The rest of the world will reap the benefit of cheaper EVs. In 2 years' time, CapEx will be cheaper for EVs compared to others. In fact, in Germany last year, 50% of all fleet cars sold were EVs. The change is well and truly underway. So, these are the things that we need to be thinking about as investors. What are the next crop of policy changes? So what's happened this year? So we now have more than 115 countries committing to 2050 net zero policies versus two years ago. And we have all the major economies committing to strong 2030 targets, figuring out how to do it. In Japan, METI, Ministry of Economic Trade and Industry, now has a working group, and they publish papers this looking at what they can do to change the Japanese economy to meet Prime Minister Suga's commitments. And one of those, by the way, is going to be a green hydrogen and green ammonia angle, a big push in that area. In the US and so on. In China, one of the questions was what's happening with coal in China. There's a fight going on, as there is a fight in the US, as there is a fight in Japan, and so on, between legacy industries and new industries and the government. So last year, in the middle of a global stimulus, China said, spend money, keep people employed, come what may, so we don't dip into recession in the middle of the pandemic. Keynesian stimulus. All the provinces pulled out what they know how to do. They said, let's restart these coal plants on the energy side. There's lots of other stuff too. In January this year, the State Council, the Cabinet of China, released a report looking at the National Energy Agency's decisions last year in energy. It said the National Energy Agency had made a grievous error in approving coal-fired power plants that were approved by the provinces last year. It recommended the dismantling of large chunks of those plants that were already in construction. And then it said that the leadership of the National Energy Agency had failed to follow Xi Jinping thought in supporting coal. Whoa! If that isn't a change of policy signal, I don't know what is. And we've got different kinds of things happening in India, where the price of solar is changing so fast that it's becoming economic. We now have, according to IEFA, and a think tank in the US, 60% of coal plants in India operating a loss because all of the industrial customers have been taken by solar. They want to buy cheaper energy and more reliable energy. So you've got the change. This is underway. So for an investor, are you ahead of this? Are you thinking forward? What's going to diminish, have value destroyed in the next 5 years in the way we've already seen in the coal industry in the US in the last 10 years? Well, this report gives you a whole lot of clues, and it gives you clues about whether value will be created. Companies in India that are rapidly growing their renewable energy exposure, they're going to be worth, like NextEra is in the US now, a lot more in the future. And that happens in everywhere. That's in land use, in food, in property. It even applies to your filter around sovereigns. When you start thinking about the creditworthiness of sovereigns, those sovereigns that are taking steps to ensure their economies are future fit are going to be a lot better position, creditworthiness going in the future than they are now. It's everything.
Yeah. I just want to make sure that we pick up a couple of the questions there's quite a few questions coming in the Q&A. So there's a question here, it's to Ashley and Sean. It says RSPR is developing solutions for each and every country based on my new weather climate solution technologies. Even when our country clients are ready to adopt our solutions, they're usually unable to finance solutions. There's a great opportunity for you to get involved in our efforts, or to ask us to combine our efforts to achieve results. Anyway, maybe this is more of a comment. They're happy to talk. Sorry, there is someone though that has asked. So let's talk about that offline. Sorry about that. There's a question here about what your view of Japan is, and you just touched on that, and how they will follow the huge change needed. And are they able to meet their net zero targets by 2050? So maybe you want to take that, Sean. But before that, someone also asked, what does actually net zero mean? So if we're going to talk about net zero, maybe we should start with that point.
Well,
what do we actually mean by net zero?
Well, I actually have been, I must say I've been typing away
Good on
various
you.
answers to people. And
Yeah.
one of the things I want to promote now is the PRI website has an IPR section on it, of which there are many, many papers. And there's a couple of papers that I usually end up referring people to. And one is called Pathways to Net Zero, which really explains, in our view, scenario architectures, what net zero, what people are really trying to do here, and how, I'm afraid, watch out, it's complicated, but it's there. And another one is a paper on nature-based solutions for negative emissions technologies. Those two papers, actually, I think are well worth a read if you've got the brains, if you've got the headspace for those. But what I would say is, what Pathways to Net Zero point out is there are many, many ways to get to net zero. Net zero just basically means at some point, whatever you're emitting is being offset. Whatever's going out, getting pulled back in at some point of time. The problem is, it's the pathway to net zero that counts, as well as the net zero. So if you say, I'm going to get to net zero in 2050, you could go there with a massive overshoot and then vast amounts of negative emissions technologies in the second half of the century. You could do what the IEA NZE is doing, and we will do. We'll go in a very fast pathway there, and you will require massive policy intervention in order to get you there. So I do feel, I'm going to say this, one of my pet sort of things is that this net zero, throwing out net zero at a particular date, great, but how are you going to get there? And that is what IPR is all about. It's all about spelling out the pathways in excruciating detail and excruciating policy detail.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And of course, those pathways are going to change over the time as technology develops, as things move along. What people are doing is going to change. And I think that's why the IPR works good, because it's also continually updated from what's happening around the world, and things move. Then where do we go to next? Sean, there's a couple of questions. I just want to wrap a couple of questions in here. It's really about, what's happening in Africa, but also bringing into the discussion about, there's a lot happening, obviously, with the pandemic. There's a lot of people suffering, particularly in developing countries. So how do we get ambitious climate policy within developing countries, and overlaid with the pandemic on top of it all?
Look, interesting question. I just want to pick up the question you raised earlier first about Japan, and will Japan reach its 2050 targets? Yes, they will. Blanket rule in there. Because we're in the middle of shifting the supertanker, and Prime Minister Suga, on his maiden speech to Parliament as Prime Minister, really staked out a position here, which is now central to the leadership backed by his faction and Minister Kazumi and so on. And METI is in the middle of trying to figure out how to do this. And an example of how the debate is shifting, which is an example of what you're talking about as technology advances, as understanding the future advances, how things change, is steel. So when I first shared a platform with people from the Japan Iron Steel Federation a couple of years ago, they were talking about zero carbon steel in 2050 and 20 years of gas to replace coke and coal. Not good for the climate, by the way. That's what they thought was possible. Right now, METI has started talking about green hydrogen coming in from Australia and places by 2030, and the ability to be able to shift the steel industry rapidly rather than over 30 years. That's how things are changing. And of course, it is inevitable that this will change. The only question is the bet on how quickly it's going to change. And that's one of the reasons I'm really bullish about Japan meeting its targets, because they are grappling with these kinds of issues. Hey, I'd like them to do more in a few areas, don't get me wrong, but there really is now underway that whole discussion. The pandemic as a whole, really complicated issue, brutal for people, for economies, particularly those societies that have not been very good at listening to the science. Okay, I won't name any countries, you know what I mean. I'm in one of them.
Yes.
So we have an economic crash. We need to stimulate our way out of it. We are, in places like the US and China, stimulating our way out of it. We finally, since 2008 in many places like in Europe, learned Keynesian economics. But as we rebuild our economy, we've got to create jobs, but we also have to do something fairly obvious when you start thinking about it. We can't rebuild for the past, we have to build for the future. That's build back better. And in that opportunity, if you mix that with Keynesian stimulus and with the job creation with certain kinds of activities, for example, energy efficiency improvements across our whole building stock will create millions and millions of jobs. If we do it quickly, you can sort of see how we can bring all of these things together, address the social challenges, the employment challenges, and the climate challenges as one package. And that's our opportunity. And that's what Europe's trying to do at the moment, very much so. And also, it's also what China's trying to do. Let me hasten to add. And now I'm waiting to see the nature of the Biden administration's policies as he goes on, but the signals are very, very strong and very, very good in terms of what they're trying to do. So that's the obvious answer to it, right? We do have to address the social issues. We do have to get people back to work. And also, as we build back better, we've got to tackle something the pandemic has taught us. The resilience of a society is not just determined about its resilience to physical challenges, it's also whether we've got a resilient and a well-designed health system. If people can get free health in the middle of a pandemic, they are less likely to keep on working and spreading the disease, which is what we've seen happen in too many countries. So we've got a broader set of issues we've got to start tackling now in terms of resilience, which are linked to climate.
Yeah, I think that the other thing is, I'm going to bring Ashley in to talk about this as well, but I think there's the perspective that I think from the pandemic perspective, one of the positives, if we find any positives in a pandemic, is I hope that people start to understand in a far more concrete way how interconnected things are. So it stops siloing issues as an environmental, a social, or governance issue, because they're all interlinked. And it's clear that you cannot have a healthy economy if you don't have a healthy planet, but also that you don't have healthy people. They all completely go together. And also on the social side, coming back to the point Mark was making in his opening points about a just transition, that this has to be central to what we're doing. We can't make, workers in the fossil fuel sectors be the people who are paying the costs for climate change because they're left behind. We have to walk and chew gum at the same time, bring them along and think about the investments in the future. I was doing a parliamentary hearing in Australia yesterday, one of the countries where there isn't great progress because you've got a lot of workers in the mining sector. But as I was saying to them yesterday, you can't just think about the jobs now. We have to deal with that, but we also have to think about how we create the economy and the jobs of the future. That doesn't happen overnight. You have to be planning it for decades and decades. So lots of issues wrapped in there. But Ashley, I wanted to maybe bring in your thoughts from BlackRock about, in all the work that you're doing, how do you tackle some of these issues to do with the pandemic, to do with emerging economies, but also to do with the social side of the environmental issue? How do you think about that in your work?
So before I get that, I would just like to go back to a comment that was brought up a minute or so ago, and there's a question in the chat about cement and steel. Yeah. To really just emphasize for the audience that what is so important about unpacking scenarios, and it's what Sean was talking about, is in terms of like looking at companies and sovereigns' forward plans, and really being able to make investments today in them, not on what is their footprint today, or just looking at carbon footprint intensity, but really thinking about how are they planning for the future? How are they transitioning? And it will be different for different companies and different sectors, and it will happen at different speeds. And this is what these scenarios tell us. And so, for example, cement and steel, they transition at a different speed than other sectors, right? And so there are technological advances around what was mentioned, green hydrogen, that will play into that. And so when we look at those types of companies, we can benchmark them at different time periods and on different technologies than we do for others. And so I think that that's really what the brilliance is in terms of looking at these integrated assessment models and understanding that there are different speeds and pathways depending on what region of the world you're in and what sector you're in. And so, so just to put a flag in that is that I think that these forward-looking indicators are really the ways that we can develop portfolios that are net zero aligned, that will be transitioning over time on their own, filled with companies that are transitioning according to these pathways. And then back to the social question that you asked, I think that I think the pandemic was really interesting. I would say that at the start of it, we all thought, wow, is this really going to take focus away from sustainability, climate risk? Are we all going to retrench, like we did after the global financial crisis, and just focus on our immediate day-to-day quarterly financial goals? And I would say everyone has really been pleasantly surprised that the opposite has happened. I think that for us, the uptake and the desire for more sustainability tilted products has even accelerated. I think, Fiona, this, maybe that you pointed to this, that there is a sense of collective vulnerability, I think, but I think also there's probably a sense of what is possible if we all work together. Right. And so the global response to the pandemic in terms of the speed that the vaccines came out and, coordination between countries, I think can show us what's possible if we all act together. And I think there also this, bringing up this idea of what is going to happen if we don't address this in terms of whether it's natural disasters, but also the spread of disease in terms of, the physical risks around this. And so that's definitely highlighted that. But in terms of the just transition, it just kind of flows back into thinking about the IPR and the policy implications of that, is that takes political will. To have these policy changes takes political will, which I think is there and growing, but at the same time is balanced against some of these social constraints. So I think we have to be very careful in to accomplish these things, that we are thinking about the social implications, that we are taking care of people that are being moved in this transition. And at BlackRock, you mentioned how are we thinking about this? How are we helping contribute to this? We, not to plug product, but we've recently launched an emerging markets fund that only invests in green, social, and sustainability bonds. So use of proceeds funds. So really contributing and putting proceeds into those economies, but making sure that we can ring fence them and that they're done in sustainable ways, and being able to report to investors what that looks like. And so I think there's a lot more transparency that investors are getting, transparency that our investors are asking, and a desire to really direct the flow of money that we're putting into investment into things that are going to have a positive outcome. Yeah.
Thanks, Ashley. I completely agree. There's a couple of other questions here I might just wrap up for you too. There's thank you for your observations. Are investors patient with long-term investments related to climate bonds, or is there a need for liquidity keeping some on the sidelines? And there's also just here that you mentioned unpacking the onion on scenarios. And is this because the market needs better insight on practical shocks, which are more specific regionally or sectorally? Other questions to you.
So I think the reason why green bonds have worked so well is that they really do provide you a lot of liquidity in a climate investment compared to something like a traditional renewable infrastructure fund, for example, which you might have 10-year lockup and be quite illiquid, whereas green bonds are really, you have daily liquidity, you have the QSEP, you have the credit risk of the issuer. And so for traditional fixed income buyers, I think that that's why green bonds have been so successful. So on one side, you have the transparency and the impact, and where your money's going, but on the financial side of it, you have the risk that you've been accustomed to that is digestible in an asset allocation that you're familiar with in terms of your fixed income allocation. So for our green bond funds, we will keep some cash on the sidelines, especially in something like an EM fund where we're really trying to incentivize new issuance. We need a lot more EM green bonds. Sean, I know, is working hard at that. But I think that if you build it, they will come in the emerging markets green bond space. And so we're really hopeful for that sector. And then, sorry, what was the other question?
Sorry, Ashley, I just got to amplify that. Everyone on listening to the call, you hear what you said? We need a lot more emerging market green bonds. Please go out and get some for us. We want them.
Thank you, Sean. I was going to get you to jump in on that. The other question was, actually, let me just find it again.
Oh, on scenario work?
Yeah, on scenarios, yeah.
So I think that there are, look, there's some amazing work that's being done in the space, and it's moving at Mach 10, right? But I think that we want to make sure that the larger investor community stays educated on the developments around some of these topics. And I still think that there is work to be done in thinking about what net zero means to that question earlier. Net zero, according to what underlying scenario. And so I do think that we need to continue to socialize and inform the generalized investment community around the pathways that we're looking at, how realistic they are, what goes into these models, and that's just a function of time, a function of people getting more comfortable with climate models. I think that it's, there's been a huge pickup in looking at some of these models over time, but I think that there's room to go on that in terms of general investor education. And the PRI is doing a great job in helping support that. So,
and I'd like to say, I think in a sense that's what IPR is trying to do. It's trying to say, look, I mean, here's our version, but understand why we're doing it. Why are we? What else is going on out there? What is the context? What are the pathways to net zero, which discusses quite a number of models. It's about a year old now, but it's still got the basic idea in it. So, and I think this is very important because as a sort of a technocrat type, you listen to the debate and you think, gosh, I get it, but I don't think people quite realize the devil, as always, is in the detail, as always. So if you don't get the thrust of where this stuff can leave you, let me give you, one of my other pet questions at the moment, right? So if we attempt to, double down on very, very ambitious policies to get to 1.5 degrees, which we do, but part of those is to say, as a result of that, we don't want to go near negative emissions technologies because they're just going to distract everybody. And 10 years from now, we're overshooting. We're 10 years behind the development of the nets. So this is a very difficult time for everybody. And I do remember when I was back working on this stuff, 15 years ago, we used to say all of the above. We're going to need all of the above to get this climate crisis sort of sorted. And I think let's be careful about very precise scenarios that exclude this. Let's see what might happen, but let's make sure that we're developing every possible technology and way of getting this crisis under control.
Okay, Mark. So we've talked about the fact that things move on. We need to develop a whole lot of things. So we've got a new round of forecasts for investors that are due later this year. You talked about the current ones being nearly a year old. So this is going to be an update for investors to the IPR for forecasts to 2030 and 2040. So what's in the pipeline? Can you give us a bit of a sneak peek about when this is coming out and what's going to be there?
It's coming out at one of your digital forums.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
So on October the 18th, it's always very dangerous to give a date when you're doing research, but whatever. On October the 18th. Need deadlines.
Yeah,
we expect to be releasing the forecast policy scenario results, which I think are going to be interesting because when we first produced the FPS, as we called it back in 2019, we were hovering a bit above 2 degrees in terms of the result that we generated from our forecast. But we weren't too far off 2 degrees. In the old world, everyone might have said, oh, the interesting question now is, with the acceleration in policy and technology, will we be nudging under 2 as a forecast? It's going to be interesting, but it's not going to be 1.5. So what we're doing, as I say, we will release on October the 18th, the high-level findings of the required policy scenario and compare them with the forecast policy scenario, particularly the policy gap, as I call it. In other words, what extra do we really require over and above what I suppose people already consider as ambitious in our forecast? A lot of people look at our forecast and go, gosh, I'm not sure you're going to get that. And then we're saying, well, okay, fair enough. Then you want to sign up to 1.5? Go have a look at what you require for 1.5.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah, it is interesting. I remember when we had the first piece of IPR work came out, and at that stage it looked so ambitious. How are all of these things going to happen? But as you were saying, now they are slowly starting. These things are slowly starting to happen.
And I would love to be surprised that someone turns around one day and goes, "Yeah, well, we did the required. We did it."
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be fantastic?
So, Sean, so I often talk about the fact that investors and investors' business have been really ahead of many governments and policymakers when it comes to climate action. But do you think that this is starting to change? Do you think the pace is starting to change? And looking out to 2050 or 2030, will this pressure build such that policymakers, governments, central banks are really forced to take much more drastic action?
Well, well, first answer is there's no other choice to achieve our climate goals. Need to bet that. But yes, things are changing. What's changing in investment circles is we've moved to a stage now we're trying to shift our portfolios around to better predict the future. And when I was young, I always wanted a crystal ball. Well, I got one. It's called IPR, which is a crystal ball for the future of what's going to happen on climate change. So suddenly I've got something, so I can shift my portfolio around, as we've heard Ashley talk about BlackRock looking at doing that and slowly getting, or not so slowly, it's quite quickly actually recalibrating. But at the end of the day, we've got a bit of a problem, which is we can shift our portfolios around, but the ship has to turn. We can shift the deck chairs in the Titanic, but it's the Titanic that has to shift, which is heading towards an iceberg, and that is the whole economy. So the question, which is now beginning to be addressed by many investors, is what's their role in helping shift the Titanic? How do we take this work, such as IPA's work, to governments and support those governments that are beginning to figure out how to shift, like Prime Minister Suga in Japan or President Biden, and also start talking to the people that aren't changing. You can guess who I mean, but there are a few around. They need to be pulled into line. And one of the ways they're going to pull into line, by the way, is preferential sovereign bond purchasing program. We're going to start seeing that happening in the coming year. That relationship between funding, asset managers, institutional investors that have been ahead of the curve in understanding long-term risk and want to see the investments that they need to invest in created by government policy so they can have a sustainable portfolio, and the governments who then need to act. And here they've got a fiscally efficient toolkit to be able to achieve their policy objectives. That relationship with the regulators in between, the central banks who are starting to act, is pivotal. And if we don't get that right, we are toast. But I think we are in the process of getting it right over this year and next year.
So just picking up on that, on the sovereign bond side and with sovereigns, and when do you think that's going to happen? If we're talking about predictions, as we are with IPR, when do you think there's going to be that change that's going to happen?
We're seeing
to pick up those recalcitrants.
The first stage is we're seeing a rapid growth of green sovereign bond issuance.
Yeah.
European Union is about to start for $250 billion equivalent program of green bond issuance, for example, which is more than the entire green bond market a couple of years ago. So we will see growth in this particular segment very quickly, which provides investors an opportunity to engage and to differentially engage, which we'll see how that plays out. There's going to be an interesting thing happen in the next few months, because we're going to see a sovereign bond from Russia, sovereign green bond from Russia, and we'll probably see a sovereign green bond from Saudi Arabia as well. And the question will be whether, because these are petro states, right? The question will be, how solid will the credentials be? How will investors react? And I'm going to tell you at the moment, what I'm hearing out of Saudi is actually very positive, because one of the hidden gems of the world is the Saudi 2050 plan, which recognizes that oil will not be a driver of the Saudi economy in 2050. They're trying to become, or at least in the decision maker, I'm not going to say in Aramco, but they're trying to become a clean energy and a hydrogen exporter and an ammonia exporter. And for example, there's already a $6 billion green hydrogen ammonia plant being built in Neom in northern Saudi Arabia. And the green bond will expose a few of these things. So that's the case. If it looks like that, I'm all for it. I'm saying, yes, let's give them bouquets when they're doing the right thing and kick them in the shins for the bad things. But it's going to be a bit of a test, this. And if there's pricing differential, real test, let's just see where that goes. At least oversubscription. And then, of course, the other side of the equation is where they're going to see capital strikes for governments that are not doing the right sort of thing, haven't got change plans. You saw the first taste of this a couple of years ago when the Riksbank in Sweden said, with the central bank, said it was now no longer going to invest in governments that had very negative climate policies. And they announced the withdrawal out of 2 Australian states, you will remember, Fiona. And that's kept on going. I'm speaking to large asset managers now, some of the world's largest, who are asking the question, how do we act now? Can we have a filter, a risk-based filter, right? Because this is all about countries that are not taking the steps to be future fit, to ensure their creditworthiness stays in the context of these rapid changes that we're about to see. How do we get that kind of filter? And that is going to be the story of next year. IPR will be one of the tools we use to assess those kinds of issues. It's going to happen. Get ready.
I have to have a quick comment from a recalcitrant country I'm sitting in. But I would say what fascinated me was the Australian Financial Review, which is, very good, but conservative newspaper, reported that the Australian government was more worried about capital strike than they were about a CBAM.
That's right.
And, so there's no doubt these moves by investors and the signals investors can send are very powerful.
Yeah. What's your view, Ashley, on this?
Yes. So when you think about constructing sustainability tilted portfolios, especially in fixed income, you have to think about how you're going to approach sovereign bonds. And so green bonds from sovereigns have been a great option for us on those ESG type portfolios. So, some of the potential future issuances that Sean talked about, yes. I mean, that's the type of thing that a sustainability tilted portfolio wants to buy, right? That's a transition tool. That's a true way to help fund transition. There are a number of funds that will have an ESG lens on them that's sort of a screened or positive upweight that might not be able to buy some of the debt from companies or sovereigns if the entire corporate or sovereign entity is viewed as a laggard. But when you create an instrument like a green bond, we can then direct proceeds on that. And so those will be welcome in the green bond market. They will be welcome in our ESG fixed income portfolios as long as the use of proceeds is good. And I know if Sean is involved, they will be. And so I think that's great positive momentum.
So just picking up, because Sean, you were talking about Saudi. And so there's a question here, and maybe you've already answered it, about kicking them in the shins when they do something wrong. But why do Saudis need to sell green bonds? They have trillions in savings. They could apply to green initiatives. So is it greenwashing in a different guise?
The mysteries of capital markets and fundraising and why does Apple issue a whole lot of bonds despite having hundreds of billions of dollars in cash floating around? What I care about is if they're going to raise money, they're allocating the green, and there's boosting the narrative of change and the differential and their internal incentives. I'm not going to care about their own cash, their treasury policies. That's a separate question why they do it. There are many reasons why people do it. So, and Ashley might be able to comment about that. In Saudi's case, they actually need money because the oil price has been down so low. They've got deficit issues. There are investment challenges for them in making the shift fast enough. So they actually do have some challenges. Russia has big challenges in these areas, but these are more complex questions, I'm going to say, about how you manage your cash pile efficiently and take advantage of low interest rates while you can, and so on. The key thing is, I'm going to tell you, it's tied to impressive policies. It's tied to things we want to support. And that's what we've got to really be focusing on here. Have I spoken out of turn, Ashley?
Ashley?
No, all fair. Just the one thing that I would add is that that when you think about a green bond and the credit risk of the green bond, you are still looking at the parent. And so while we're directing proceeds to these projects that we think are future-proofed projects, we still are exposed to parent risk. And so that's something that we consider when we price bonds, when we think about what is, the yield spread that this bond has to trade at, is the risk of the parent. And if the parent in whole is still behind the transition, and we think there might be financial implications to that, that will impact the price that investors are willing to pay for it. They might be willing to pay a little bit through the non-green version of that, but overall, that would be something in terms of their transition narrative in their entirety, but also what their fiscal situation looks like.
Yeah, I certainly know from at the PRI, you know, when I started at the PRI and we were talking about ESG integration, everything was focused on the listed equity space, and people always used to say, oh well, we can't really do anything when it's got to do with the sovereign side of things. When we were talking about fixed income, it was the corporate side, but you can't. But now we've got all of these working groups. You know, it's quick. I suppose it's slow progress in some ways, but on another, it's how quickly things move. Now we've got all of these different working groups and engagements and everything happening on the sovereign side. So it's great to actually see how things do change, and mindsets do change as well. Oh, there's another comment here about that we need more racial diversity on the panel. So I've acknowledged that we've got some good gender diversity, and we've looked at having people from different countries, but do want to acknowledge that we always need to do more about also trying to make sure that we have gender diversity, not just gender diversity, but racial diversity. I don't want to just gloss over that that comment. So Mark, I was trying to drag you in to tell us a little bit more about, I know we're going to release it in October, but what are some of the key areas that the new forecast is going to focus on? I want to get people,
yes,
you know,
I
really excited about coming to this in October, about what's going to be there that's going to be different from today.
Oh, well, I mean, after this seminar, it's a must-see event. But, what I would say to you is that I think that one of the areas that I am focusing on in terms of us emphasizing is the regional aspects of net zero. And I think that for an investor, it's probably quite important whether you think the US, EU, China emerging markets, what is the phasing of net zero and how believable is that and how close are they? Because if you want to align your portfolio, if you really do, with, you know, net zero 1.5, then, you know, you've got to decide how you will look at that regionally. And then, of course, there's the much complex question of supply chains. Global supply chains really do make that complex. But nevertheless, I think this issue, to me, it's going to be fascinating, is that how you know, how much do we require out of, you know, the EU? How much extra do we require out of the EU to get a convincing 1.5, rapid 1.5? How much more out of the US? How much more out of China? I think you require a huge amount out of China, because, I mean, I'm just going to give this statistic. I'm a bit obsessed with this. I've written on this years ago. The Chinese coal fleet is 12% of world emissions. That's bigger than the US economy. The Chinese coal-fired fleet is bigger than the US economy in terms of emissions. If China does not come up with a solution for that within their net 2060 target, someone asked me, why are you confident that China will address it? Well, if they don't, sometimes you have to be confident because it's inevitable. You know, they have to face it. So I think it's going to be this regional thing will be very important. I also think it'll be very interesting to see whether our forecasts have progressed as to a notable lower temperature outcome. And this is a forecast, you know, in terms of our forecast. That's what I'm interested in looking at. And I think generally the land use, again, you know, we're working a lot on land. You know, everyone talks about the energy system so much of the time. But if we don't get land right, we have no chance again. It's like, you know, and I think there's some just fascinating technologies here. I mean, I'm going to say it, the replacement of the cow, not the internal combustion engine, the replacement of the cow. I mean, technology, you should see the private equity money that is pouring into food-based technologies. It's, you know, I see it, comes across my desk. It's really, you know, the big money is the investment community is about to to plow into land use. That's a good one. Plow into the land use issue. So yeah, I think there's lots of interesting things, and I think the RPS and what it requires is also going to be very, very interesting, and the policy gaps.
Okay, the replacement of the cow. I've never quite heard it put that way. My mind is boggling. I've got all of these images swirling around in front of my eyes now about the replacement of the cow. So we have to wrap up now because we're just coming to the end. I think we've tried to get to as many questions as we can, but I want to make sure that we honour people's time. So first of all, I want to thank Mark and thank Sean and thank Ashley for their insights and for their time today. Thanks for staying up late, Mark. Thanks for getting up so early, Ashley. Really appreciate it. I also, of course, want to thank the Climate Bonds and the IPR team for organising the webinar. You know, these things don't just magically happen. There's, of course, a huge amount of work that goes on in the background. And so we really appreciate it. We really appreciate all the work. So do look out for the IPR forecast that are due in October that we just talked about. They will be at the PRI Digital Conference from the 18th to the 21st of October. All the information is on our website. A reminder that you need to also register, and registrations are open for the Climate Bonds Annual Conference. It's the 6th to the 10th of September. Don't miss it. Go and register. If you'd like today, there'll be lots more discussion on all of these topics coming up there. And also just reminding you that we will send you an email, and it'll have the presentations, it'll have links, all of those things that you can also, we'll have a recording so that you can watch this, and it's also available on YouTube. So let your colleagues know if there was things that were interesting here today. So thanks everyone for your time.
Fiona,
yes.
Before you
Sorry,
go, I've
Sean.
got to say a special thanks to our producer, Andrew Wiley, for serving up hardball questions. To stop being so tough on us, Andrew. But I also want to say, this is going to change fast, everyone. If you want to know, if you want to get an insight into what's going to change fast, this is your crystal ball. You've got to get involved with this IPR stuff, because we have the opportunity to foresee the future. This is the closest you're going to get available now, and then change everything as a result. Plug for IPR.
Great. Couldn't think of a better way to finish. And again, great plug for IPR. And as Mark said, all of the information about IPR is available on the PRI website. So it's www.unpri.org, and there's a whole section on the inevitable policy response if you just put it in there. So thanks everyone, and stay safe and well. Bye.